for ourselves and the future, I believe that we're headed, towards a future where disability is going to be more and more present. And I also think that specific knowledge and wisdom from disabled people, I think, is what is really essential to navigating that future. And so I think that if we have a shot at surviving, I think that disability needs to be something that is valued, essentially, and disabled life needs to be valued and seen as worthy.
Hello and welcome. As always, I'm Abbie. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and today, I invite you to join me in conversation with Hannah Soyer as we take a communication perspective on disability justice and changing stories. To take a communication perspective is to consider what we're making and how we're making it through our communication practices. This means we look closely at patterns, context, stories, and relationships, and that we use curiosity, mindfulness, collaboration, and dialogue to create better social worlds. So whether the topic of today's conversation is familiar to you or not, the hope is that using a communication perspective will reveal new ways of seeing and being. At the top of the episode, you heard our conversation partner today, Hannah Soyer. Hannah is a queer disabled writer living in the Midwest. She has written for nationally acclaimed publications such as The Sun magazine, Bustle, and Cosmopolitan. She is the editor of The Ending Hasn't Happened Yet, an anthology of disability poetics. She writes a column with Rebecca Taussig for New Mobility, and her debut lyric memoir, Dreams in Which I'm Almost Human, is forthcoming from Red Hen Press in 2026. This is the third episode in our Unheard story series. Hannah has a lot of great things to say about stories and her experience and understanding of how stories shape us. So I'm really glad to be able to include this conversation with her as part of this series. And the more this series goes on, the richer meaning I am attaching to the title of Unheard Stories. In this conversation, I have really started to see it in two distinct ways. One is that stories like Hannah's, Rebecca's, Emily's are widely unheard to people who do not identify as disabled or neurodivergent in those specific ways. But also, as Hannah mentions today, even though she herself lives a story shaped by disability, in many ways, stories of disability remain unheard for her as well, because she's also not hearing from others, whether that is personally or through books or movies. At least she did not hear a lot growing up. And what we'll talk about today is that we are starting to hear more stories that are providing better and better representations of individuals with disability. And all of this is to say that the stories that go unheard are powerful too. That the lack of stories shapes us and how we see ourselves. So in listening to this conversation, I hope we can all be encouraged to reflect on the unheard stories of our own lives, but also to seek out more unheard stories of the experiences of others that look nothing like our own stories. So let's continue the conversation with Hannah. Hi, Hannah. Thanks so much for joining me for this conversation today. I've really been looking forward to it.
Hi, Abbie. Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, I'm really excited.
Especially excited on my end because we were connected through Rebecca Taussig, who I just think so highly of. And so I know we share a love of her.
She's a phenomenal person, a phenomenal writer.
Yeah. So I'm excited to get to hear about you as a writer and as another phenomenal person, I believe, as well. So let's start with that. Can you introduce yourself? I know that asking you to share your story or tell about yourself is such a huge question. So you can kind of choose the things that feel important for us to know about you for the context of this conversation today specifically.
Sure. So I'm Hannah Soyer. I generally describe myself as a queer disabled writer living in the Midwest. I have a neuromuscular disability, so a lot of my work, whether that's writing or art or any sort of creative outlet that I do, a lot of that is exploring my specific embodiment and how that impacts both how I make meaning and how I move through the world around me and how I interact with the world around me. I'm a huge fan of disability justice frameworks. I think that those are ideas and concepts that I feel very strongly about and that I feel at home in. And beyond that, I am a huge cat and chocolate enthusiast.
Awesome. That's a great start. And you left me with something I want to go back to too, is that, yeah, this work that you do as a writer, artist, speaker, all of the things that you do. Could you talk a little bit more about that and kind of maybe where your inspiration for that comes from? What are the experiences you've had in your life that kind of led you down this path to want to do what you do?
Sure. So I think that most writers have this similar experience of growing up and not having stories that necessarily reflect their own experiences. I think that that is something that I'm guessing here that that's common. I think that it is.
Yeah.
And I think that for me, that was something that certainly shaped my younger aspirations to really pursue writing. And it's fascinating because this experience I had when I was younger was not necessarily tied to my physical disability, but felt very related to mental health struggles that I was going through as like a preteen, young teenager, and not having any stories, not finding any stories. And I mean, keep in mind, like I was a voracious reader. So it's not like I wasn't, looking for
Right.
narratives and stories and characters that could reflect what I felt, what I was experiencing. And I couldn't find anything. And so that ultimately, really led me to believe that I was alone in these mental health struggles, and that something was wrong with me for feeling so anxious and so depressed and so like isolated, and just in a really dark spot. And that, of course, exacerbated the mental health struggles. And before, that really reached a breaking point when I was in eighth grade, in which then I finally asked for help and got help, which was, not just life changing, but also life saving.
Yeah.
Before I got to that part, I started writing these fictional letters. My friend and I had a sort of, I don't know, casual writing project where we would, we had created these characters and we would write fictional letters back and forth to each other. And I put the exact mental health struggles that I was dealing with into that character. And that was, again, like very powerful for me. And so I think that as I, received help related to my mental health and, started going to therapy again and got on antidepressants and started learning all of these tools, that same idea of needing to create stories that accurately reflected what I felt I was going through in my own lived experience, that idea expanded beyond just mental health. And, I really started to think about that in terms of my physical disability and my physical embodiment. So yes, I think to answer your question
Yeah.
of like, what inspired you, or like what sort of was the catalyst to push you in this direction? I think that largely it's the idea of wanting to create stories in which I saw myself reflected. And I think it's also, of course, then about connecting to other people. And I think that also writing for me is such a therapeutic thing. Like it's therapeutic and it also feels very sacred. I feel like when I am writing something creative that is not writing something creative of my own, like, I don't know, I don't want to say like my own free will, but when I am doing something, I'm writing for myself, not like an assignment that's been assigned to me or something that has an external factor to it. There is this very sacred feeling of entering into this serene, magical space where I feel I'm connecting deeper with myself as well.
Yeah, yeah. I'm such a big verbal processor and I love language and I'm such a believer that I don't know if this is something to believe in or just a fact actually, but if you don't have the language to talk about something, then you don't talk about something.
Oh, for sure.
Which is so what you're getting at. I'm not
Yep.
seeing stories around me, so I don't know how to make sense and make meaning of what I'm
Yes.
going through. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. I'm curious about that connection that you were able to make between, okay, I am struggling and the struggling is amplified because there's a lack of stories that resonate with me around me. Was that something that you as a young person, as a teen, were able to feel and notice in the moment? Or is that something that kind of upon reflection, you're able to look back and say, well, that's what was going on?
So I think related to the mental illnesses, mental health struggles that I was going through, that was something I recognized in the moment, because it was it felt, it was very explicit. Okay, I read all the time. I consume all these stories. Nobody is experiencing what I'm experiencing. Therefore, something is wrong with me. And yeah, so I think that definitely I connected to in the moment. There is a lot of this same idea related to my physical disability and my specific embodiment in the world that I realize it and I reflect on it more in hindsight. And yes, I can go more into that. Would you like me to go more into that?
Yeah, sure. I'm glad that you're kind of saying it's both in response to my
It
question, because
is
that
totally
makes
both.
sense. Yeah, there's an initial kind of noticing, and then as you grow and reflect on it, maybe you're learning and seeing even more than you could have in the moment. Yeah. So yeah, please elaborate on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that with my physical disability, growing up and now, although I also feel like I feel like we're alive at a very lucky time of story diversity. And so I feel that I have gotten to witness the vast proliferation of, more diverse and authentic stories. And that's incredible. And there have been so many times just, within the past year, even where I've read a book that is relatively new, like in the past, I don't know, 5 years, say, and there's some disability representation that just floors me, absolutely blows my mind. And when that happens, I always obviously feel very excited and happy, but there's also this sadness that comes with that of thinking, okay, I didn't have this as a kid, and reflecting on how that lack of representation impacted me specifically. And I was thinking about this a lot yesterday when I was sort of going over your questions and preparing for this. But when I was probably like late elementary up through high school, I was very into a young adult fantasy series. Well, actually, the author, her name is Tamara Pierce. If you're familiar with her, if any of the listeners are familiar with her, and she published many different young adult fantasy series. And they were all like, all of her series feature, young female protagonists who are badass, strong, talented, do all of these really, cool things like become a knight in a world where really there's only male knights, and, you know, become these incredible sorceresses and all of these different things. And also the young female protagonists um in those series, beyond just that, like there's also so many moments throughout her books in which the characters are really advocating for people in vulnerable positions and speaking up in the face of injustice, and all these great things. And those series, so I was really into them when I was quite a bit younger. And then when COVID hit, I actually found the audiobooks for them and I re-listened to all of them,
yeah.
which was a really lovely experience to revisit that time. And re-listening to them, I mean, on the one hand, I was, again, I think, blown away by how fantastic they are. And also, I would argue, very ahead of their time. The first series that Tamara Pierce released came out in like the early 80s, which was just like shocking to me. And like, truly, the series that she writes are great. Like, there's so much female empowerment and advocating for others, and also lots of moments of sexual liberation, just really all ahead of her time, right?
Yeah.
But re-listening to those also then caused me to think, okay, these are the characters that I looked up to, and these are the stories that I looked up to and found refuge in. And every single one of them, is not just able-bodied, but also these like paragons of physical ability.
Mm-hmm.
And how much then distance that put between myself and these characters who I was then, enamored with in so many ways. And I think that sort of realization and reflection and exploration, yeah, I mean, I just think that's very fascinating, of how, like, obviously how different our present might be if our past was shaped by different stories.
Yeah, as you're talking, I'm kind of like picturing young Hannah taking in all these stories and not seeing yourself. And I think that
Yeah,
there's many young people, and I'd go so far to say as adults, that still
for sure.
find themselves not represented in stories, not just in childhood, although that would be really meaningful, transformative, and youth especially. But I'm thinking of I'll back up a little bit. So my work, which is all around what I call taking a communication perspective, which to me is about making this theory of communication, which is called coordinated management of meaning, or CMM, making it practical, because it's a theory. But there's a lot of tools in it that I think it's kind of my whole goal is, like, if people knew these, if people felt confident in their communication and had this kind of perspective, then they could be totally empowered in their communication and storytelling. And one of those tools, which is actually where the name of the podcast comes from, is called the loop model. So that's L, 5 U's, and then 2 T's. So the L being for lived stories, and then the T at the end being for told stories. So there's the name of the podcast, stories
Cool.
lived, stories told. And the other T is storytelling, the act of storytelling. And then all of the U's, which really could be infinite, are all of these other kinds of stories. So the ones that we talk about in the model, though, are untold stories, unheard stories, unknown stories, untellable stories, and undigested stories. And I was thinking of that model as you're speaking, and maybe this kind of gets back to what you're talking about, of the kind of age of storytelling that we're in, that is very hopeful, but there's still so much to do.
For sure.
And I'm thinking about what kind of the if this, then that, or what the kind of reaction has been to when we come up against untold stories, or if you as young Hannah are sitting there saying, I'm not seeing myself represented. I think for a long time, people have from that point gone to, well, something must be wrong with me.
Mm-hmm.
When really what I would hope and would maybe come about if people had a greater understanding of storytelling and communication is that if they come up against not seeing themselves represented, encountering untold stories, saying, oh, well, just more stories need to be told and I need to tell my story. Like that feels kind of like
for sure
a hopeful version. And I kind of wonder where can you kind of intersect in young people's lives, in adults' lives who didn't have it as children, like you were saying, to say there's nothing wrong with you because you're not represented. That is a fault of the system and the culture that you live in that has not prioritized these stories. So that was just kind of me rambling, but I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I think that that's so true. I think that it's also so complicated because there are so many instances. I mean, I think specifically when I'm thinking about lack of stories that I had regarding my physical disability, because a lot of that, I did not recognize in the moment. I think that it would have been difficult for me to jump to that conclusion of this is the fault of our culture. And I think that obviously as I've grown older and, reflected on all of this more and lived through a lot more as well, there are many times where I'm able to think that and, entertain that as probably true. But there's also, there's so many ways that stories shape us beyond just like, okay, I'm not represented, therefore something is wrong with me. I think, there's also just the idea of, like if we are represented, but we're not represented well, and we may believe that, this is how our life is going to play out, or this is what's in store for us, or something like romance and intimacy isn't something that we're worthy of. And I think that making that jump to this is something that is culturally, or this is something that is the fault of our culture, definitely takes a lot of awareness and reflection, and I think connection with other people who are able to, affirm that, I think. So yeah, I think it's like, it's very true. I think it's also very complex.
Yes. Yeah. I'm so glad you say that because it's easy for me to sit here and be like, oh, well, just don't be, discouraged by the untold stories. A lot, easier said than done kind of thing. And you're right that it's so not as simple as purely, are you represented or not? But yes, how are you represented? And what do these stories teach you about you and the life you can live and the life that other people are thinking for you and how you relate to other people? That, it's just so deeply complex. And so I guess maybe what I'd want to kind of alter what I was saying to is say that, at the heart of this, if you can, like I'm saying, what a communication perspective means to me is really like kind of like having this like toolbox full of things that are helpful. So if you, like you're saying, like after years of reflection and learning and growth, then you can look back and have the perspective to say, that was a product of a system that is working against me. That's not me. But of course, 12-year-old Hannah can't have that perspective, but if you have something like this loop model to even begin to understand that there are some untold stories and that those shape us too, that it's
Oh,
not
for
just what you're
sure.
hearing, but what you're not hearing, the lack, there's
For
also
sure.
meaning in
Yeah.
there, then that feels like a good kind of tool to have, maybe truly just for reflection,
Yeah.
to look back and try to understand. I'm curious about how you talk about storytelling with people, maybe how you explain it, because there is, like what we've already talked about, fiction and books that we read, like those are stories that shape us too. But
Mm-hmm.
when I talk about stories, I'm talking about something so much more broad, and I think you are
Totally.
too, of like the stories we live, and like
Yeah.
everything is a story. And so I'm kind of, I feel like I struggle sometimes still to try to explain what I mean when I talk about stories. So I'm curious to know kind of how you think about it or talk about it.
Yeah. I mean, that's such a great question. I think that like stories are how we make sense of what's going on around us. I think that, as far as I know, I think that most people process reality and life through stories. And I also think that stories are what power and shape and turn the world, essentially. And so I think that, yeah, I mean, I don't know. This could get like super complex and
Yeah.
theoretical and everything, but I think, there's our life, there's like what we do, how we live, and then there's the story that we tell about that, or the many different stories we tell about that. And then, there's the stories that we tell about what's going on around us and the people around us and how we interact with the people around us. And there's the stories that, we tell about the life around us beyond just human life, but,
Mm-hmm.
the earth and plants and the animals around us. And of course, the stories that we tell about all of these various life forms. And I mean, not just life forms, I guess, but really anything going on
Mm-hmm.
around us. The stories we tell about that, of course, those shape our beliefs, which, then, of course, shape how we're going to act. So, like, for example, say you have the belief that animals, are intelligent and sentient and able to feel emotions and communicate. That story, may then influence your belief of, okay, I should not eat animals, which, might then influence you to say, okay, I'm not going to eat animals. So then, of course, your behavior isn't then impacted. So I think that there's that. I think also storytelling is a way of processing a lot of things that have happened to you. So I think it's meaning making, both internally and externally. I think that, especially for people whose stories have been in so many ways told for them or
Yeah. Right.
robbed,
Yeah.
I think that storytelling is especially powerful. There's this quote, and I'm going to find it so that I
Yeah.
can. I mean, there are many, many, many wonderful quotes and pieces by disabled writers that discuss the power of storytelling. Harriet McBride Johnson comes to mind. Alice Wong comes to mind. Many, many, many people. But specifically, a quote that I've been thinking a lot about recently, and this is from the book. Let me find it. Okay, so this is from the book Crip Kinship, The Disability Justice and Art Activism of Sins Invalid. And Sins Invalid is a really phenomenal queer and disabled performance collective based in San Francisco. And so this book, which was written by Shada Kafai, they document the history essentially of Sims Invalid and how essentially that collective came to be. So I'm going to read the quote. Is that?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Okay. So writer and professor Arthur W. Frank explores how stories refamiliarize and reroute our body minds, especially if we are disabled or chronically ill. He writes that, quote, the personal issue of telling stories about disability and illness is to give voice to the body so that the changed body can become once again familiar in these stories. The body is often alienated, literally made strange, as it is told in stories that are instigated by the need to make it familiar, end quote. And then Shada continues, we tell our stories as a way to speak to our body, for our body minds. With these stories, we create new routes and new maps back to ourselves. Because so many of us often do not speak in our own voices and are instead spoken for, disabled storytelling is a radical act. So I was really interested in this idea of how stories told by other people and by other people essentially and cultures and systems can remove ourselves from our bodies, make our bodies unfamiliar, strange, and then how telling our own stories allows us to find our way back to our bodies.
Yeah, you used the phrase meaning making earlier, and that's such an important lens for me. And that feels like kind of a good broad term to cover what you're talking about, in that's really empowering to me too, to kind of take on the perspective that, well, there are many different ways to make meaning. And like you said, that's exactly what storytelling is. It is sense making. It is meaning making. That is what is happening in the stories. And that, so yeah, like CMM theory would be considered a social constructionist theory to say we are the active participants who are making choices and showing up and communicating in ways that build our social worlds. Right. And then of course, like we've already kind of talked about, the social worlds also shape us as we're shaping them in this kind of story feedback loop, if you will. But I think that meaning making piece is really key. And, tell me if this is not how you see it at all, but kind of how I understand your work to be is offering this new meaning, kind of going back, you've said, there's maybe some dominant narratives that have been told not by people with disabilities about disabilities. And your work is maybe going back to some of those stories and kind of rearranging them, and say, well, let me offer you this other way of making meaning to empower you to know that you can make your experiences and your stories mean different things for you. I think of meaning as, again, if it's this thing you have choice in, part of the question when I think about it is kind of like, does this meaning serve me?
For sure.
And I don't know maybe how to describe that a little better, but that feels like if you're like looking at all these stories and saying, well, these don't feel true and real and reflective of my or other people's experiences, then that's a meaning that doesn't serve you. And we should ditch that and make new meaning and tell new stories is kind of how I think about it.
Yeah, no, I think that's so true. I mean, I think that two things that came to mind when you were saying all of that is, one, I think that there's also so much to be said for what that re-meaning making or making new meaning
right
can be said just for yourself. Like, even if you are not doing that, telling your own story with the goal in mind of impacting other people, I think one of the most important, and I think truly one of the biggest gifts you can give to yourself, is to do that for yourself, because that's huge. And I think that oftentimes writing and any sort of creation as it's, taught in schools is very much around this idea of creating with an audience in mind or writing for an audience. And first of all, we don't know who that audience is, right? Like that audience is most likely, at least, if we're talking in regard to disability, an audience is most likely assumed non-disabled. And so if I create with a non-disabled audience in mind, that of course is going to shape how I write and what I write. And so I think that, just completely disregarding that assumption and disregarding that need to create and write for an audience is very powerful.
You're making me think too about this. I've, seen you write about this before, and it's something I think a lot about for myself too. Kind of perceiving people perceiving us.
Oh, yes.
And that's like, I feel like I've been very oriented toward that as someone who is socialized. I would, correlate it back to being socialized as a woman specifically, and many other, elements I think affect this. But this kind of like, I am going to be more in tune with what you think of me than what I think of me, because what you think of me is more important and I need to cater to that. And so I'm just going to become a little performer over here to be exactly what you need. And that kind of feels like a parallel way of what you're talking about writing, is that writing for an audience is perceiving how you're being perceived. You're catering to something outside of yourself. So yeah, I wonder what else you think about and have written about when it comes to maybe kind of overcoming that. I don't know if that's something that's kind of the goal you think of, or just what it means to pay attention to perceiving how others are perceiving you, and how you try to move through that.
Well, I think, specifically related to writing. So I would say that this is something that I have, only recently really began to think about, like within the last year. Because a writer friend, mentor brought this up to me, and he said, what if you didn't write like you were explaining to a non-disabled audience? And that was very powerful for me to hear, because it truly wasn't something that I thought of before.
Right.
And I mean, I also just want to say though, like, because we live in the world we live in, and because we live in the culture that we live in, which, is deeply entrenched in ableism and disregard for disability, I think that explaining to an assumed non-disabled audience, I certainly think there's a place for that. And I don't think that, that necessarily, I don't think that should be discarded at all. I think that is very important. At the same time, I think that there is something very powerful that can happen when, myself at least, when I let go of that need to explain and just create and write what is actually flowing through me, I guess, in the moment. And so I don't think it's necessarily like overcoming it or working through it. I think it's just thinking about being aware of it and being conscious of it as I create.
That makes sense to me. And I'm kind of thinking about, we've kind of covered, like, from your perspective, most of the time, at least, what writing is not. Is, if I can let go of writing for anybody else or writing to explain myself or justify myself. And so I want to talk a little bit about what writing is to you and what you hope for writing to be. And again, because I love the language, I want to pull some of this language that you've used on your website, and that is to talk about storytelling as beautiful acts of survival, resistance, and as community building. And so I want to know a little bit more about that language and what it means to you that storytelling is all of these things.
Yeah. So I think two things to answer your question. First, of like, what is writing? This is something that I've been thinking a lot about recently, because writing is so much more broad than I think, our standard definition of, say, forming letters and words and sentences with a pencil or a pen on paper or typing. And I think that I'm trying to think too. So Rebecca Tossig and I have a joint, and we're loosely calling it an advice column, but that's very loose, in New Mobility magazine. And by the time this episode comes out, you said it's coming out in July?
Yeah.
So probably the one that we just wrote will be out by then. And it actually a bit tackles this question of being a writer, but living in a body which sometimes does not allow us to write, or not allow us to write in, those standard ways that I cited earlier. And this truly, is something that I think about a lot because my condition is progressive. And so, theoretically, hypothetically, I will get weaker as I get older. And so, who knows if I'll be able to type on a computer as I am now. But I also know that, I do a lot of writing on my phone, on my Google apps or Google Doc apps. And I also think that I write as I am forming sentences, throughout my day. And so I think that there's various ways that we write and various ways that we create, which of course is then related to your question about storytelling. And I think that, as we discussed earlier, I believe that, our culture and our world is powered by stories, and there are sort of these overarching, overpowering stories that hold up the structures in place, the systems in place, that keep these largely not great systems able to continue to work. And so I think when those of us who are not served by that system, which I think that you could argue most, if not all people, are not actually served by the systems that are in place. When we, are able to get in touch with true, authentic, genuine stories about ourselves and our lives and our, families and communities and our loved ones and all of that, when we're able to get in touch with that and then tell that story, I see that as resistance in that way. And I also think that, of course, telling stories, telling the, authentic stories is community building, because it's reaching out to other people and saying, this is what my life is like. And then, of course, people on the other end of that, hear your story, read your story, and think, oh, okay, actually, I experienced that too. Or I experienced something similar, but mine's a little bit different. Here's what my life is like. And as far as survival, I think it comes down to what I, shared at the beginning of our conversation of when I was growing up and I did not see my specific mental health struggles reflected back to me, that, led me to believe that something was very, very wrong with me. And I think that having stories that you can see yourself reflected in a genuine, authentic, empowering way are lifelines essentially that we can, grasp onto. And then on the flip side of that, I think telling your own story, that is a method of survival as well, because you're continuing to voice your existence, and I think like the worthiness of your existence as well.
Yeah, I like that. And I think kind of building off of this, what writing is, what storytelling is, and what you hope it to be. And we've kind of talked about, okay, maybe there's a what I would call an old story. It's kind of very
For
dominant
sure.
about disability, but also we could expand, like you're saying, it's all living things and the earth and
Yes.
how we relate to, or what other
Yep.
oppressed groups and marginalized groups experience.
Yeah,
We could talking about this, but we're talking about all of it in a way too.
for sure.
I want to know, in your words, what is this new story that you are hoping to tell through your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such a fascinating question too. I think it's super complex. I mean, I
Yes.
think that one, I want anybody who reads my writing, hears me speak, etc., to come away with, the belief that disabled lives are worth living. I think that that's not just a belief that we all need to adhere to for the people in the world who are currently disabled, but for ourselves and the future. I believe that we're headed, towards a future where disability is going to be more and more present, from, natural disasters, climate change, lots of other not so fun stuff. And I also think that specific knowledge and wisdom from disabled people, I think, is what is really essential to navigating that future. And so I think that if we have a shot at surviving, I think that disability needs to be something that is valued, essentially, and disabled life needs to be valued and seen as worthy. But I also, really want people, and I want myself, to feel that we're allowed to change our story. I think that especially as writers, well, I don't know, for me at least, like I wrote a book, which is my memoir, my experimental memoir, which is coming out through Red Hen Press in 2026. And so much of that, revising that and trying to get it to a place where I felt it was ready to be seen, that was a process of ultimately allowing myself to say, okay, this was me when I wrote it, and I am not necessarily that same person anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And that's okay. I think that's so important that people know that they can change and grow. I mean, that's what we all should be doing as we get older. And I just think that's super important. And I also think that I want people to know, and again, myself to know, that like definitions and categories are very fluid. They're not, set in stone. And yeah, I think that like we're always all in flux at all times.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that knowing that, and allowing ourselves to lean into that and believe that is very, very important.
And right at the beginning of you answering this question, you say it's complex. And it is. And that's like, I feel like I go into my conversations just with the assumption that everything is complex, and to me, there's value in that. And so the
sure.
response to complexity, which is difficult for people if they maybe haven't practiced it is leaning in, right?
Yeah.
Rather than kind of backing out and being like, I think just like oversimplifying stories or
Mm-hmm.
lives or experiences or meaning is like the biggest
Yep.
disservice we can do to ourselves. I
Oh, for sure.
understand why it's the instinct in maybe
Mm,
like a self-protecting kind of way of like, oh my gosh, I don't even know how to hold all of these things to be true at once. So I'm just going to act like half of them don't exist, and again, just
yes,
such a huge disservice. And so to me, it's kind of like flexing them, like, like working out to strengthen this
for
muscle.
sure.
If leaning into complexity is a muscle to strengthen,
Yes.
that's something we have to practice. Because one way I'm thinking about our conversation is that it maybe feels complex for people to think about accommodating different disabilities in
Mhm.
whatever, in the physical spaces they create, in the content they create, whatever it is.
For
That
sure.
feels like a complexity of like, oh, well, I don't really think about that for me. And so I'm just not going to think about it. Because
Yeah.
maybe it's like, well, I don't even know where to start or whatever, whatever. But again, that's that moment where I'm like, oh, I just want to invite people to just like lean in and flex the muscle of what, my kind of hope is, or what I'm taking away from this conversation is that if this kind of new story that you've just talked about can really like take hold for people, then the impact of these stories, like I said, we build our social world. So these stories, the impact of these stories is that our social worlds are going to get more and more diverse, like you're saying, in the stories that we hear
Yes.
and in the kind of ways that we see people being in the world, physically, mentally,
Yes.
emotionally, whatever it is. And that kind of accommodating is just kind of the example that the one element of it that I'm thinking of right now is going to be second nature. That's kind of the hope that
Yes.
if the stories normalize things so much that it is just part of the world, not this us and them, not this
For sure.
othering, then that feels like, can this kind of story of, I don't know, maybe, I don't know, you could tell me what language you'd use for this, but this story of like inclusivity, normalcy, inclusion. But if the story becomes so widespread, then that thinking about how that shapes the social world and what our world actually looks like and how we act in it, I guess, is what I'm trying to get to.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that, like I've said so many times, I think it's so
Hmm.
complex.
Yeah.
I think that there are so many complexities and nuances to all of that. I think that every single person is unique and every single story is going to be unique. And so I think that, a part of it is being able to hold space for that uniqueness and that difference. And see that as something that makes our world stronger, not weaker.
Right.
With the idea of the new story, I really like that. I think that also it's like we have a new story and we need to allow ourselves to have another new story whenever the
Yeah.
new story, is no longer serving us,
Yeah.
as you brought up earlier. And I also think, and this, just to go back to, you asked me, what is that new story that you're hoping to tell people with those stories? And as I was saying, disability wisdom, crip wisdom, which to me feels very tied to disability justice and those frameworks. And I think that something that is so incredibly important and a very crucial pillar of disability justice is the idea of interdependence, or, the fact that we all need other life to live. We all need other people to live. We all need other life forms and spaces to support us. And I think that that is something that allows us also to think about how we might tell different stories that ultimately serve ourselves and our communities much better than the story that's currently being told.
Yeah. Yeah. That's such a great point. And I kind of like want to use that same metaphor of like working out this muscle again. That what I think you're saying is like in telling new stories, we kind of strengthen ourselves to hear more new stories.
Yes, for
like
sure.
what I was trying to say before is not say like, okay, if we hear like the one story about disability, which is does not exist, like you said, that's not what I was saying of like, oh, if we hear about disability, then we know about disability. But if we hear stories from people with different perspectives, then the kind of default, normative stories that have been really dominant in as far as being able-bodied, as far as people being straight, all kinds of, the kind of dominant groups in a lot of ways that are not experiencing oppression. I keep saying things and then being like, well, no, it's more complex than that. So that's just the whole thing.
No, but I totally understand what you're saying. I totally understand what you're saying.
Yeah. Just the flexing the muscle. Yeah.
Right. Anytime we practice something, it ultimately, hopefully, gets easier. And I think that, being exposed to one story, consuming one story, listening to one story, witnessing one story, all of that, that hopefully allows us to receive more stories.
Yeah. And that's why I think your work is specifically rooted and focused and centered around disability and your experience with that. But everything we're talking about today is also about so much more because hearing the quote unquote new story of your experience for people that haven't lived that experience personally can invite and welcome and kind of expand the understanding, expand the imagination, expand that capacity to sit in the complexity of many, many stories existing at the same time, being true for people in different ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Hannah, I'm so thankful for our time today. And as we wrap up, I just want to give one last opportunity. Is there anything we haven't gotten to talk about yet today? Anything you want to leave people with?
Well, first of all, no, thank you so much for inviting me. This has been wonderful. I think I say no, and then I'm going to say something. I think, I just want to reiterate that creating whatever that might be, storytelling, whatever form you may tell your story in, doing so for yourself and your own healing and growth is valid enough. Like, you don't have to do it for anybody else. That for yourself is sacred. And also, I think, again, allowing ourselves to then create, tweak, change any stories that are no longer serving us. Allowing ourselves to change, I think, is very, very important.
Yeah, I love that. As leaving people with that is that tell your story and change your story when you need to as well. It doesn't have to be one story. Yeah, that's really wonderful. Yeah, thanks, Hannah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Abbie.
Okay, that is all for our conversation with Hannah. At the end of each episode, I like to offer some questions to reflect on. This acts as a next turn for us, so the conversation doesn't stop just because the episode does. Today, the questions I would have you think about are: how did you, or did you not, see yourself represented in stories growing up? And how did that shape your understanding of yourself? And how has your story changed? You can reach out to me to share your reflections as well as your own questions or ideas. And you can do that through email, the website, or by commenting on Instagram and YouTube. The podcast is also available to be found on the CMM Institute Substack, which is www.cmminstitute.substack.com. And that's also a great place to interact and engage with the podcast and other listeners in the comments section there. Links to all of these places are in the show notes. And the reason I invite you to share your reflections with me or now with others on the Substack is to stay in dialogue. Other great ways to keep dialogue going are to follow the show wherever you listen, leave a rating and review, and most importantly to me, share this episode or any other episode that's been meaningful to you with someone you want to invite into the conversation. I am supported by the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. This podcast is just one of many initiatives designed to help us engage in better communication practices with the goal of creating better social worlds. You can learn more about the CMM Institute, the CMM Theory, and our other initiatives at the links I've provided in the show notes. Again, that new Substack for the CMM Institute is a great place to engage with resources and with this community. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious. And thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.